6 quick tips. Try that again. 6 quick tips to understand the Old Testament. I recorded a bunch of nice video for you guys yesterday, but it was all terrible autofocus stuff. So we got to be really quick today. So here we go. Number 1, the Bible is written in different genres. When we read the Old Testament, we realize that there's different types of writing that's there, and we can divide these into 3 major types. You have Genesis all the way to Ezra and Nehemiah, that's history. Then you have Job all the way to the end of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, that's poetry and wisdom literature. And then starting with Isaiah and going all the way to Malachi, we have the prophets. Now these are 3 different genres, mostly historical narrative, poetry, and then prophecy is a mix of poetry and historical narrative. It's preaching. So when we're reading the different genres, we're dealing with them according to their various different genres. And it's important to especially take the prophetic books and to put them in the context of the history. Point number 2, perhaps most importantly, the Old Testament is a Christian book. The Old Testament belongs to the church and not to the synagogue. This is an important, especially we're tempted in our day to read the Old Testament like, what is the common phrase that says that the New Testament is concealed in the Old Testament and the Old Testament is revealed in the New? We got to say, I'm going to Minneapolis, by the way. We got to really be quick. But the chief doctrines, the 3 great mysteries and the 3 chief doctrines of the church, the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the redemption of Jesus, are all taught in the Old Testament, and clearly in the Old Testament. I'd refer you to how Peter preaches about King David in Acts chapter 2, where he says that as a prophet, he knew that his son, the Messiah, would be raised from the dead, that David knew these things, the prophets knew these things, which lead us to point 3. The Old Testament is a book about Jesus. Now, this is an important doctrine. It's taught in the New Testament. Jesus himself says to the Pharisees, you read the scriptures thinking that in them you have life. You don't recognize that they are those that testify about me. Or we have the road to Emmaus. He took them through all the prophets, showing them that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer before he's brought into glory. Or even Peter's preaching, the most clear, I think, in Acts chapter 10, where Peter says that all the prophets preached the forgiveness of sins in the name of Jesus. Now, Jesus is in the Old Testament in 3 distinct ways: by promise, by picture, and by presence. By promise, because the Old Testament prophets would promise the coming of the Messiah, the virgin birth, the born in Bethlehem, his death and resurrection on the 3rd day, and so forth. But second, by picture. The chief picture of Christ in the Old Testament is the sacrifices, that God is accepting, in fact, the death of another in my place. That lamb didn't sin, but God is accepting that lamb instead of me, and this is all pointing to Jesus. And then third, by presence, in fact, Jesus was there. He was the one walking in the garden. He was the one in the burning bush and in the pillar of fire. He was the one that appeared to Joshua. When it says by the prophets that the word of the Lord came to them, who is that word except for Jesus? Which leads us to point 4, tip number 4, and that is Genesis 3:15. We've done another video unfolding Genesis 3:15, but this is the fountain from which all of the prophecies of the Old Testament flow. After the fall, the Lord comes to Adam, then Eve, and then to the devil, and he says to the devil, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. That's the promise, that there would be a man who would be born, who would have the sonship of God, divine authority, to be able to destroy the devil. And in the destroying of the devil, he himself would be destroyed. It's from that promise that all the promises of the Old Testament flow out. It's like the fountainhead of all of the Old Testament promises. It's absolutely beautiful, and we'll put a link to the video that talks about that in more fullness. But you can't understand the Old Testament unless you understand Genesis 3:15. Point number 5, the timeline or the top 10 dates of the Old Testament. To understand what's going on in the Old Testament, we have to understand the major flow of events. And I've got 10 dates here. I'll also put a link or somewhere down there in the description to where you can go and track these links down. But these 10 dates help us to understand the broad flow of the Bible. And it's good to be able to put the prophets and the different events in their particular order. So again, we're going fast. you might want to take notes on this. We have the 4 major events of the creation, fall, flood, and Babel, and then we pick up with Abraham, the birth of Abraham in 2166 BC. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and that's when we have the migration into Egypt in 1876. The children of Israel are down there in Egypt for 400 years or so until we have the Exodus. So this is the time of Moses in 1446 BC, and we remember that the wandering in the wilderness was 40 years. So the entrance into Canaan under Joshua is 1406. That led to the time of the Judges, which ended with the monarchy, the king. We had King Saul, King David, and King Solomon, the 3 kings of the United Kingdom. And the middle one to remember is the enthroning of King David, 1010 BC. Now, King Saul, King David, and King Solomon were all 40 years. So if David was, if David was 1010, then that means Saul was 1050, and David died in 971. That's when Solomon took over and built the temple. So the temple, 971, and then Solomon's death, 931, and that's when the kingdom was divided. Israel on the north, Judah in the south. And that division of kingdoms lasted for quite a while, for a couple hundred years. They were sometimes allied with each other, sometimes fighting against each other, until the year 722, when Samaria, that is the northern kingdom of Israel, was destroyed by the Assyrians. That's the time of Isaiah and his contemporaries, and those guys came down there and just walloped the northern kingdom and deported them all. That's when the 10 tribes just disappeared, and they came all the way to Jerusalem, but the Lord spared Jerusalem for another 150 years until 586. Some people date that 587. That's the destruction of the southern kingdom by the Babylonians. That's the time of Ezekiel, the time of Daniel and the other exiles. That's the time that the people are over in Babylon crying by the river until 538, and you have the Edict of Return. So it's 70 years after the first deportation, which happened 25 years before the last thing. But anyway, it's 538 when the Israelites start going back under Ezra and Nehemiah, and here you have the later prophets, Malachi and these guys, all prophesying about the rebuilding of the temple. And this goes on until 420, right around 420, when you have the completion of the Old Testament. That's the time of Malachi, the close of the commandments, the last prophetic voice. There's 400 years then of prophetic silence until John the Baptist and Jesus comes on the scene. Now, 6th and last, law and gospel. You guys, I think, knew this was coming. To understand the Bible, we have to understand law and gospel, that the Lord speaks to us with promises and he speaks to us with threats. He gives us commands and then he gives us gifts. And that distinction between law and gospel runs all the way through the Old Testament and into the New Testament as well. In fact, I think that Luther picked up on the distinction between law and gospel by reading the minor prophets. They'll say, hey, look, you guys have sinned, and so the Lord is going to come and visit your iniquities, but he's preserved a remnant and he'll give gifts there through the kingdom of the Messiah. So there's 6 quick tips for understanding the Old Testament. Let me know what you think in the comments below. We made it. I suppose there are some advantages to being in boarding group C and never remembering to check in online. Whew.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Southwest Airlines, this is Thai Flight Crew. We'd love to welcome you to Honolulu and say mahalo. But I'd be lying, we're not there. We're in the other sunspot called Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are